Welcome to Survey Booker Sessions. Tune in to hear from people working in a range of industries and roles to provide you ideas that you can take away and use in your own business. I'm your host, Matt Nally, the founder and director of Survey Booker, which is the leading CRM and survey management system for surveyors. On this week's episode, we're speaking to Sybil, who is the head of diversity, equity and inclusion at the RICS. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Anytime. Would you like to, I suppose, give us a bit of background as to what your role within the RICS is? And obviously that'll shape the context, I think, for the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So unlike, EDI or DEI leaders within an organization, one of our firms that are looking predominantly internally at how the business operates, I do look at those things and I collaborate closely with our HR team and other business leaders within the organization. But I've been put in this role to really look at DEI for the entirety of our membership. So looking at how we can support our firms, how we can leverage the best practice and the expertise that exists in the industry, bring that in-house, and then reflect that back out to the membership so that everyone can learn collectively, do better collectively. So a lot of how I'll speak to this today and answer the questions today comes from that perspective of looking externally versus getting in the weeds of internal best practice.
Perfect. And so I suppose if we start with the basics, what does diversity, equity and inclusion cover? Because I think there's so many things we obviously talk about day to day now,
Yes.
And I think it's hard to keep track of potentially what the meaning of different things are. So it's good to start with that as a base.
Yeah, absolutely.
Point.
We just had some all employee vision events for our organization, and that was actually the focus of my briefing when given the platform, is to really unpack the acronym. And so happy to do that now because I think when we look at what is happening in the space and a lot of what people are focused on, it's purely that diversity piece, which is just representation. It's data. It's that, makeup of who it is that exists within our organization, within the membership, within the wider industry. That's it. It's just the data piece. So if we're only focusing on improving representation, we're missing really vital pieces of the conversation, which comes in with the equity and the inclusion part of it. And so I think it's really important to recognize that diversity just means data and representation. And having difference amongst that, any sort of population. So why we need equity and inclusion is making sure that if we're putting in all this work to recruit diverse talent into our organizations and the wider industry, that we actually have the means to keep them, retain them, promote, develop. Otherwise, we're just create this revolving door where talent comes in and leaves again because they don't feel the psychological, or physical safety working in a space because the culture isn't quite right or the policies aren't quite right to ensure that they get the access and development that they need. So when we look at equity, that's where we start drilling into our processes, our practices, our policies, and we go, right, who's getting left behind in this? Who are we missing? Is everything that we're doing accessible for everyone, when it comes to disability, neurodiversity? Are we taking a deliberate look at every individual in our organization and making sure they have the development opportunities they deserve, the access to promotion that they deserve? Are we being as equitable as we could be in the way that we recruit for talent? Or are we constantly looking at the same universities that crank out the same standard pipeline of students and not opening our aperture to other academic institutions? Or are we hiring local talent from the communities that we serve? Asking those questions of, are we being deliberate, and are we asking ourselves who could possibly be left behind in this? That's the equity piece. And I think that term gets confused sometimes. And I had posted about this recently on LinkedIn. It gets confused sometimes, one, with the word equality. They're different. Those are two different words meaning different things. Equality is that ideal end state we hope to get to as a society, where regardless of who you are, where you come from, who you love, that you're going to have equal opportunity to education, to healthcare, to career success. That's the ideal end state. Equity is the vehicle that gets us there. It's, like I said, taking those deliberate steps, having those deliberate conversations about who may be getting left behind, and then making adjustments to correct that. And so what it is looking at, rather than, I think the confusion that comes in is that sometimes people hear the word equity and they think unfair advantages. We have to just start handing out unfair advantages. You're only promoting those people because of where they're from or what they look like. That's not what equity is. Equity is about recognizing where the disadvantages are and taking deliberate efforts to remove them. It's not about handing out unfair advantages. So I think it's really, really important. And I will get on a soapbox for hours on the importance of equity and really understanding what it means. But I'll leave it there on that one. And then inclusion is the core, is the meat of the conversation that I think we need as an industry to have more of a conversation about. And really that comes down to culture. Is the culture within our industry where it needs to be to make every individual from every background feel welcomed, feel valued, and feel like they have the opportunities they deserve to thrive, succeed, in the industry. And I would say we're not there. And I think plenty of people will agree. There are plenty of historical, institutional behaviors that still need some adjusting, and so I think that's the conversation we really should be having as an industry is, how do we get our culture in a better place where everyone working within the built and natural environment, everyone working within surveying is educating themselves, developing themselves, and opening their minds to understanding views and perspectives other than their own. And again, that takes deliberate effort. So the increasing and improving the diversity pieces, while it takes a ton of work, is the easy part. The equity and the inclusion part are where we really need to roll up our sleeves. And I think do a better job of collectively and focusing in those areas.
It's really interesting. I think one of the things that made me think as well when I was reading some of your posts was that I jumped to the assumption, just I think because it's so much in the news around, it's probably to do with gender or race or the religious aspects, and I completely forgot that obviously it might include things like disability.
Yep.
Just because of the amount of noise, not noise is the wrong word, but the amount of airtime other aspects have had over maybe that one, for example, and it changes obviously. But it made me sort of rethink how the conversation could go obviously today around thinking through that better.
Yep.
What does it look like, I suppose, in terms of how do we know that we're going in the right direction? So, for example, what does the ideal outcome look like? Is it everyone's represented equally across those different factors, or will there always be a certain imbalance in terms of, I don't know, natural preference towards things, and therefore does that built in, or how do we know what we're striving towards, I suppose, is my question.
That's a really great question, and that's where the importance of data comes in. And so data is absolutely vital in getting this right. Every EDI, DEI strategy should be built around a foundation of data. And I think that's what we're lacking in our industry. And a lot of organizations are, and they're starting to cue in on this of, especially in the UK, you absolutely can and should be asking your employees who they are and what they bring to the table, because especially across the protected characteristics within the Equalities Act, you are allowed to ask those questions, and you should be. So find out within your organization what the gender breakdown is, both biological, gender, that binary biological gender, but also the wider spectrum of gender identities. Should be asking about sexual orientation, about disabilities, about ethnicity, about religious preference, those types of things. Like you can and should be asking those questions. And so using that data helps you understand the makeup of your organization. And then the important piece is knowing what you're comparing it to. So some of the work we're doing at RICS is building layers of data that make those comparisons a bit more manageable. Because right now, let's say you work in a surveying firm and you've collected the data on your organization. The comparator that exists right now is National Office of National Statistics data from the census. That's going to feel incredibly daunting and overwhelming to go, right, according to the national census, the population across these demographic characteristics are at these levels, holy cow, how are we going to get there? Because within surveying, our levels aren't there. So RICS can provide, so here's your firm. RICS is collecting data from surveyors individually so that we can say, okay, across the surveying profession in the UK, because we can ask all these questions, here's what we look like. So then a firm can go, right, if this is what overall surveying looks like, here's what we should be striving toward. We've got this comparator now. That doesn't help all of our firms who have a range of talents. They're not just made up of surveyors. So we look at our real estate firms or our construction firms. They're going to need a different kind of comparative data set. And that's where the Supply Chain Sustainability Schools DEI survey comes into play. So we're encouraging our firms to fill out that survey, and then that builds industry benchmarks and comparative data sets. So then a firm that has a makeup of different types of professions, say it's a real estate firm, they can go, right, here's what the makeup of our organization looks like because we're finally collecting this data. And now here's what overarching real estate numbers are looking at. Let's set our targets based off of that. So then it's a little less daunting than going, okay, we're trying to achieve national general population standards, which is unrealistic. And that gets to your point of, is it going to be balanced? We have to have equal representation across all demographics. That's going to be impossible to achieve because the populations that we're operating within are not balanced across all demographics. So it's really about understanding data sets and knowing where you are, and then having something reasonable, manageable to compare that to. So we're really doing that foundational work, trying to create those layers. But yeah, any firm trying to give a good crack at getting this right needs to be able to measure progress, and the way they do that is through data. And that's not just going. I mean, a piece of that is the measuring who's in our organization. But that, again, is just the representation part. You can also measure how long are they staying in the organization? How long is it taking us to develop and promote people across demographic groups? Everything about the DEI space can be measured. And I think, too often targets are set on that representation piece, and then we're not setting targets based off of all of the rest of it, which is all about how do you retain that talent that you're bringing into your organization. So hopefully that answers your question, in a meaningful way. But really, yeah, it all comes down to data. And if your organization isn't collecting it, you should be. And we're happy to help, firms with the question sets. We've done a lot of work with our fellow professional body partners in establishing, a set questionnaire that aligns with ONS data. So there are comparators. And so we can help people on that journey. I think the sticky part comes for firms that are operating internationally, because you can't ask the same questions everywhere. And I think that's why we get caught up in, too often the conversation on DEI becomes about binary gender, because that seems to be the only thing we can talk about globally. Everything else gets quite tricky, sticky, depending on what region you're discussing that in. But even then, there are data sets that can be collected globally, and those are the conversations we should be having as well. Rather than saying, it's too complicated, we're not doing it, we should be going, right, collectively as an industry, what can we measure, and why are we not measuring that?
Interesting. Okay, so you mentioned some metrics already.
Yes.
Are there, in terms of getting started, are there better ones to... I don't know if that's the right word, but are there better ones to start focusing on to begin with in terms of making headway into understanding your position and where to go?
Mm-hmm. Yep. I think at the very least for firms operating in the UK, you should be collecting across all of the protected characteristics. I know there's a lot of organizations that want to look at social mobility. That's a complicated one. There are a variety of ways you can collect that data and a variety of questions that you could ask, but no matter what, there's no one question that gets you at social mobility. And so that's a really complicated one. But I would say at the very, very least, every organization in the UK and Ireland should be collecting across all the protected characteristics. It's not compulsory. We can't force people to answer those questions. It is still personal, private data. But you should give people the opportunity to say, this is who I am and this is what I bring to your organization. So that, organizations can set those baselines for themselves and understand who actually works in their organization. I think we find it challenging, reporting rates of disability is one that's a tough one. Disclosure rates are often low on that one. And I think that comes back to the culture piece. Do your employees feel safe enough to tell you who they are? And so I think running the exercise of asking if employers find that people are not wanting to disclose that data, that should send up a big flag that our employees don't feel safe enough to disclose that data to us. How can we do some work here to fix that and to change that? So no matter what, it's a good exercise to run, to ask these things. Obviously, small and micro firms are going to be up against it because their teams are going to be so small that being able to protect that privacy is going to be really challenging. With a small data set, people will be identified because if you only have, 5 people working in your firm, you're going to know whose data is what just based off of who you see sitting around you. So that's tricky. But there's still a conversation to be had around DEI for those small firms that isn't just about data.
It's an interesting point, though, about the openness of the business culture generally, because if people aren't willing to bring that up as part of that discussion, then there's a lot of things that might not be being discussed generally day to day about improvements of the business or employee morale, all that type of stuff. So it feeds into a lot of other aspects. You mentioned a point around people maybe misunderstanding the sort of positive discrimination aspect. I don't know if you use those terms specifically, but I think that's what you're alluding to. Yeah. The RAF obviously recently, one group that was in the news recently for that type of thing being on the wrong side of things from a legal perspective. How do you avoid that sort of potential route if you once you've set your understanding of where you are and you're looking at where you want to get to in terms of improving that DEI aspect? How do you do it in a way that is inclusive and isn't, the wrong side of that line, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the conversation is, don't get in the business of hiring people because of what they look like or where they come from, because that's where we get in uncomfortable territory, and no professional wants to be hired into a role because of the color of their skin or their religious beliefs, or their sexual orientation. No one wants to be that token hire. They want to be hired because they're an excellent candidate and they deserve the role and they've worked for it. So I think the way to not get down that rabbit hole is if you've taken your data set and you go, right, here's where our big gap is. We're really, really lacking ethnic representation, diversity of ethnicity in our organization. Then that's having deliberate conversations about how you recruit for talent to bring in a pool of more diverse candidates. If you're having the conversation once you've already had your shortlist and you recognize it's all, white men between the ages of 30 and 55, and you go, oh, sugar, like we've got this homogenous group again, but you've already done the shortlist and you've already done the recruitment. That's too late to be looking at it. It's got to be all the way back into what kinds of recruitment firms are we working with? What kinds of networks are we partnering with? Because there's a lot of fantastic networks, looking to support organizations in the built environment to do better in this space. Like, are we deliberately recruiting differently than we have in the past? And if the answer is no, then we're not going to see a different pool of candidates. We're going to keep getting the same kind of talent coming in. So it's about making those changes as early as possible in the process and trying to do some deliberate recruitment in those areas. And yeah, like I said, just making sure it doesn't become a conversation of we're only going to, recruit ethnic minorities and that's it. We're not going to interview anyone else. You could go down that road, but it's going to start getting tricky and uncomfortable, And so I think, and if firms really aren't sure, if they know they have some deliberate targets they want to try and meet, then I would say the best bet is to work with a consultant, because a consultant can make sure that they talk through all the fine details, really look at, okay, what are you trying to achieve here? And then, do that in the most ethical, responsible way possible, that still supports a firm in trying to achieve the targets they're trying to achieve without going down that, affirmative action, positive discrimination route that sometimes can be good, but it's a slippery slope into getting into, like I said, people feeling like they've been hired into an organization just because of who they are and not the expertise and experience they bring to the table. And so, yeah, that's a really complicated one for sure.